Inside the Dorado County District Attorney's office, there are boxes and boxes of files. They've all been solved, but there are others waiting to be reopened.
You hear the term closure. I don't really agree with that. I've been in this business for a long time. But there is something when you can go to a victim's family and say, we know what actually happened and we can prove it, and this is the person that's responsible for it, that it changes their life.
In 1985, Jane Hylton, a newspaper columnist, was stabbed to death and found in a home in El Dorado Hills. Ricky Davis was convicted of second-degree murder.
At some time about 2014, I was approached by the Innocence Project, and they were convinced that he was wrongfully convicted. I asked Anne Marie Schubert, the Sacramento County DA, if their lab would process the evidence, in particular the nightgown that was on the victim, and which they did. And they eventually ultimately identified a saliva and that was mixed with the victim's blood, and were able to separate that saliva and identify it as belonging to an unknown male.
That unknown person wasn't in a database called CODIS, or Combined DNA Index System, that is used by law enforcement.
The DNA and unknown male profile had been identified sometime before, but it couldn't be linked to anyone because the individual that ultimately had committed this murder had not been previously arrested, and his DNA was not in CODIS.
Law enforcement wanted to use investigative genetic genealogy, which is different from their traditional DNA testing, so they worked with gene by gene. The company has their own lab and is also the parent company of Family Tree DNA, which has a database. The profiles contain more data points than traditional law enforcement DNA testing, and they're able to find more relationships between people. In the case of Ricky Davis, genealogists mapped out a family tree of that unknown profile.
So then what you do is try to say, you look at public databases that are out there, that genetic databases where family trees have been built, just oversimplifying a little bit, and try to use those markers and say, can we identify a second, third, first cousin? And then try and use other types of investigative techniques to narrow that down and say, from that, can we identify this person?
The other samples came from people who have gotten their DNA tested for ancestry, among other things, and agreed to upload their results to the database. Other tools they use to build a family tree include newspapers. Obituaries help name family members too. Law enforcement doesn't have access to search it, but they're given matches of their samples. From there, it becomes a tool to narrow down a suspect.
And it's a fairly involved process to do that, very time consuming, but very reliable in terms of identifying it. And it is probably the single biggest thing to happen for law enforcement in the last 10 or 15 years.
The tools with DNA are constantly changing. El Dorado County has close to 60 cold cases, and they continue to resubmit DNA based on the piece of evidence. In just the past year, they had 5 cases that DNA and genetic genealogy have identified suspects. They identified one person involved in 2 separate cases who died several years ago. 2 other cases have not been made public and still under investigation. Pearson said the DNA technology to exonerate Davis was only available between 2 to 3 years ago. The case is the first time in state history that genetic genealogy has led to an exoneration of one man and the arrest of a new suspect.
Not only are we holding somebody accountable for a crime that they committed, but to be able to meet with, in this case, to be able to meet with Ricky Davis and say, I'm taking responsibility for this wrong that was done to you, but we're going to correct it now.